It's about this new constitution. It's about this entirely new power structure that has been created for other people that is supra legislative. It is through executive power and the judiciary, and well, more so the bureaucracy than anything. And that, I think, is what feeds into this sense of discontentment. And then if you raise this question, of course, you're branded as a white supremacist or a Nazi, because that is part of the tools that have been developed to fight this battle and political correctness and those sorts of things. In your book, you really drill down on the notion that the Civil Rights Act was perhaps, and maybe I'm wrong here, but an infringement upon some of our rights in the First Amendment. Right, the freedom of association, etc. But I was reading some of the critics of your book and some of the reviews that were written, and someone brought up the notion that schooling in and of itself is an abrogation or a violation of your rights, the freedom of association, because either you're forcing whites and blacks in the same school, or you're forcing blacks to be not in the same school together. And so do you have a response to that criticism that sort of negates this argument that the Civil Rights Act actually infringed upon the First Amendment and a freedom of association, because schooling in and of itself just does that on its own?
Well, that I don't think is the only, I don't think school is the only place where it had an effect on freedom of association. I think that particular example you're raising is one that came up in the arguments over Brown versus Board of Education, that there were two ideals of freedom of association that were clashing in that. You had a public good, which was a school. And why shouldn't black people be allowed to use it if it was their neighborhood school just because of the color of their skin? So their freedom of association in this public facility was being denied. At the same time, you had people who had moved into this neighborhood to go to this school. And they were now being told that they could not use the school in the neighborhood that they had moved into to go to. So their freedom of association was being denied as well. I think that the justices in Brown versus Board of Education decided to favor the freedom of association rights, to favor the freedom of association rights of the downtrodden group, right? So my argument is open to that counter argument, but I don't think it really ultimately holds water. We had an idea of freedom of association, particularly in the private sector in this country, that sort of like started from the founding. And it ran up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was basically that there's no right to freedom of association explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. But the right to freedom of assembly was increasingly held in the 1960s to mean freedom of association. No one should tell you, who should be friends with, what club you should go to, who you can have in your house. But I do think that has changed, and the government does now have a prerogative to intervene in the hiring decisions and in the school admission decisions of private, proprietors and institutions.
What's tough for me and for you, and I'm sure most of the people listening here, is that, the idea that a black person could be rejected service at a restaurant strikes us as just a horrible thing. But at the same time, the product of the resolution for this is now so corrupted and seemingly just a negative force basically everywhere, creating this polarization, the rise of white consciousness. It's tough for us to square that, and that's something that I have a little trouble with. What do you tell us when we think about the problem? We love the idea of solving it, but now somehow the solution
Right.
is a problem as well.
Well, what I'd say is I think there really was a consensus to solve this problem of American racism, over which we had fought the bloodiest war in our history. It had it had threatened to tear the country apart. I think there really was a consensus to solve it. Now, but the logical reason to solve it is that it was part of our history. It came out of our history. Our ancestors, some of our ancestors mistreated other of our ancestors. And because it came out of our history, it was kind of limited by our history. Okay. So we had a problem with Black and white people in this country. Okay. We didn't particularly have a problem with women in this country. In fact, if you read Tocqueville, one of the things that really shocks him is how relatively equal women are in the United States. Everyone talked about it. I mean, the Western states were the first places on planet Earth ever to give women the vote. This is a really, really good country to be a woman in. The United States was anti-gay, okay? But there was not a country in the West that wasn't, So these problems they're not particular to American history in the way that the race problem is. And I think that because Americans, seeing that this problem came out of our history, thought that the remedies would be limited. Once we'd fix this problem, we would be done, okay? What they did not expect was to be in a situation where they see someone they think of as a man who's wearing women's clothing walk into their restaurant and they say, okay, now what do I do? I mean, what's the law? What am I mean, am I going to kick this guy out? Or is someone going to arrest me? What's going to happen now? It became, because it had escaped our history. I mean, everyone understands what the Civil War was fought over. You know what I mean? Because it escaped our history, these new applications of civil rights escaped people's logic. People didn't know what to do.